As a man, he appeared to be many things. He could seem fierce and determined when leading thousands of followers on horseback in a surprise raid against a caravan. Yet he was gentle and mild when playing with children. He spoke rapidly, and his voice was sometimes so strong and forceful it seemed to echo from the mountains. Yet he would often retreat into meditative silence, sometimes secluding himself for days at a time. He could be as quick with his mighty sword as he could with a compassionate embrace. His eyes could be flashes of lightning or pools of deep compassion. He could take the part of a clever politician, a dynamic organizer, and a social reformer. Or he could be detached and inaccessible. He was strong and vital, and he walked so fast few others could keep up with him. Yet at times his body would be reduced to helplessness, sweating and convulsing from an unknown force. He had enemies, many of them, and some plotted to kill him. But thousands of others who saw him were instantly compelled to be with him, to stay with him, to serve him unquestioningly. His name was Muhammad, the Praised One. And in the 6th century, he spiritually revitalized his people and laid the foundation for one of the world's greatest religions, Islam. Today, Islam is the 2nd largest religion in the world, second only to Christianity. There are between 750 million and 1 billion Muslims, or followers of Islam, and that number increases by almost 25 million every year. Muslim is an Arabic word that means one who surrenders to God. Islam means surrender. This surrender to the will of God was the central teaching of the amazing individual who created the foundation for Islam, the Prophet Muhammad. Muhammad was born around 570 A.D. in the city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. At the time, Arabia was made up of many desert tribes with their own separate primitive laws. These tribes fought continual wars against each other. Mecca was located on the western coast of Saudi Arabia, on the spice and incense route between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. Merchants carrying the riches of Asia and Africa passed through Mecca on their way to Istanbul, then called Constantinople, the center of Western trade. In this strategic position, Mecca had prospered. It was a bustling commercial center with a great deal of wealth, and a great deal of poverty, too. The wealth was in the hands of the very few. The solidarity of the tribes had been broken up in the quest for wealth and success, and merchants had begun to ignore their traditional duties and responsibilities. Mecca was also a religious center. When Muhammad was born, most people worshipped a number of gods and idols, including the sun, the stars, and stones. The holiest of all shrines was the Kaaba, located right in the heart of the city. In the Kaaba was a black stone covered with a tapestry surrounded with idols. Arabians believed the stone had been sent down from the heavens at the request of Abraham, an ancient Jewish prophet. Abraham is the biblical patriarch who turned away from idol worship and embraced God with such commitment and obedience that he was willing to sacrifice his own son for him. Tribes from all over Arabia made regular pilgrimages and offerings to the Kaaba. Soon this revered stone, believed to be a meteorite, would play a critical role in the work of the new prophet, Muhammad. What we know of Muhammad is a mixture of fact and legend, of truth and myth, yet the basic outline of his life has remained unchanged for centuries. His father died before he was born, and his mother died when he was only 6. At first he was sent to live with his grandfather and later with his uncle Abu Talib. Talib was a wealthy merchant and a leader of his tribe, the Hashem clan. Muhammad, who was said to be a shy and easy-going child, used to accompany his uncle on long journeys by camel caravan through Arabia and Syria. For a time he also lived with a desert tribe, tending sheep and camels. Through his travels, Muhammad became familiar with much of the Arab world and the way of life of the various tribes. In Mecca, a crossroads of the Mideast, he met people of many different faiths, including Jews and Christians. He was familiar with their sacred books and with their prophets, including Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. By the time he was 25, Muhammad was an experienced traveler and merchant. He was known for his courage, fairness, and generosity. He was said to have been solidly built, tall and handsome, with black wavy hair, fair skin, and dark penetrating eyes. He was also said to have a personal charm that won men's hearts. Muhammad was hired by a wealthy 40-year-old widow named Khadijah to manage her trading business. Soon after, they were married. Muhammad and Khadijah had 2 sons and 4 daughters, but the sons died in childhood. His most famous daughter was Fatima, who married his cousin Ali. Ali is held to be the divinely ordained successor of Muhammad by the Shiite branch of Islam. As Muhammad led caravan after caravan through the desert, he found his mind seemed to be on a journey too. Increasingly, it seemed to be in quest of an answer to the question that has eternally haunted humankind. Who, what was God? Muhammad began to seek out the people and tribes that worshipped one God. He could not read or write, but he could listen to their stories and see their traditions. One didn't have to be literate to sense their strength and devotion. Muhammad soon found he was being pulled away from the world. He became less and less interested in business, and spent his time instead meditating on spiritual questions. The trade meant nothing. The money meant nothing. His home meant nothing. Something deeper was calling him. Khadijah saw the restlessness in her husband's heart, and she understood. She encouraged him to follow that heart. Others had noticed that Muhammad was unique. They admired his strength and high moral character. So when a flood swept through Mecca, damaging the sacred stone of the Kaaba, it was Muhammad the citizens chose to set the stone back in place. What he did between the time he set the stone at age 35 and the time he was 40 is unrecorded. But what he did at age 40 is etched in the hearts of over 900 million Muslims worldwide. Somewhere around the year 610, Muhammad left the city of Mecca and followed his inner voice to Mount Hira in the mountains to the north. There he stayed, alone in a cave in deep meditation. He interrupted his solitude only occasionally to return to the city for food. Then he quickly returned to the cave again. In this cave, one evening in the 9th month of the Muslim year, Muhammad had a vision. An angel appeared to him. An angel Muslims believe was the archangel Gabriel. The angel, without voice and without words, commanded him to recite. Then the angel laid before him a scroll of green silk, glittering with jewels. Though Muhammad could not read, he knew what the scroll said, and he recited as commanded. What he first uttered on that night in the cave on a mountain top became the first lines of the Qur'an, the sacred book of Islam. There is one God only, and his name is Allah. You are the messenger of God. The scroll called on Muhammad to serve as God's prophet and proclaim his message to the people. It said Muhammad was the last of a long line of prophets that began with Adam, the first man, and included Noah, Moses, and Jesus. Forever after, Muslims would honor the 9th month of the year, Ramadan, as the month in which God revealed the Qur'an to the Prophet Muhammad. It is a month of fasting, from sunrise to sunset, for 29 days. Like Lent for Christians, Ramadan is a time for spiritual purification, through fasting, meditation, and sinless behavior. The only people exempt from Ramadan are the sick, those traveling, soldiers at war, young children, and expectant mothers. And except for the children, these people must make up the fasting later. Muhammad warned that all the spiritual benefits of Ramadan would be canceled out if people engaged in any lying, slander, or false devotion. Muhammad descended the mountain, dazed and filled with doubt. He couldn't completely accept that his vision had come directly from God, though he'd felt profoundly at the time that he was in God's presence. Khadijah did believe it, and she reassured him. She became his very first disciple. Time passed, and Muhammad grew discouraged and doubtful again. There were no more visions. Though he prayed and waited and made himself ready, no angel appeared. No more messages were given. Then finally Gabriel showed himself again and said, "Arise and warn, magnify the Lord, and wait patiently for him." The revelations came again and again over the period of the next 10 years, and sporadically until he died. Normally he had no visions with them, but he often experienced physical manifestations, such as intensive perspiring on a cold day. The Qur'an itself speaks of the great weight of its message. It says, "If we were to send this Qur'an down on a mountain, you would see it split asunder." The revelations occurred when Muhammad was in a state of trance or ecstasy. He sometimes heard a sound like the ringing of a bell, but there was never a voice. The message entered directly into his heart and mind. At first, Muhammad told only his relatives and close friends. He gathered his first few disciples who joined him in worship and prayers in praise of Allah, which culminated in falling to the ground and touching it with their foreheads in recognition of God's majesty and their surrender to Him. The small group conducted their worship in privacy, but in his visions he'd been directed to tell all, so soon Muhammad began to preach publicly. Because he understood his people, Muhammad also understood that his task would not be easy. In some ways, it was more difficult for Muhammad to bring his new faith to his fellow Meccans than it was for his followers to spread it across the world. The worship of idols and pagan gods drew many tribes to Mecca and was a profitable business. The merchants of Mecca believed men controlled their own destinies, and that wealth and good management were the highest priorities in life. So in the first years, Muhammad preached in secret and drew converts in only a trickle. He knew this practice couldn't last. He had been charged with taking God's message to the world. Eventually, Muhammad became more and more public in Mecca. He told people he was a prophet. He told them there was only one God, and that God asked for nothing but obedience to His will. He called on them to abandon their idols and submit to Allah wholeheartedly. He preached that the wealthy should care for the poor, and that all were equal in the eyes of the Lord. The response was exactly what one would expect. He was ridiculed and harassed, especially by the powerful and wealthy. Piles of filth were left on his doorstep, and merchants refused to do business with his family. But there were some who believed. A rich merchant became a disciple. Then a civic leader who once persecuted him converted. As opposition to him grew, so did his number of followers. Most of these followers were young men under the age of 30, and many of them were sons and brothers of the richest men in Mecca. Much of Muhammad's teachings were, between the lines, critical of the conduct and behavior of the rich merchants of Mecca, and one of their first responses was to try and buy him off. He was offered a fuller share in trade and marriages into some of the wealthiest families. All of these he refused. In the middle of his trials in Mecca, Muhammad's wife Khadijah died. Unlike many men of his time, Muhammad took no other wives while he was married to Khadijah. Shortly after she died, his uncle Abu Talib also died. The death of Talib was critical. As leader of the Hashem tribe, he had committed his followers to protecting Muhammad, and Muhammad had needed that protection. The leader who took Talib's place, another uncle of Muhammad, refused to continue the protection. He feared the tribe would be economically ruined by boycotts by Muhammad's opponents. As these changes occurred, the hate against Muhammad reached a crescendo in Mecca. There were plots against his life, plots he discovered and was able to escape. But finally, the climate became too dangerous, and Muhammad made the decision to leave Mecca for the city's trading rival 220 miles to the north, Yathrib. Muhammad, accompanied by 70 followers, took the back roads to Yathrib to avoid being followed and arrived safely on September 24, 622. Yathrib was completely different from Mecca. It was a garden oasis in which date palms, cereals, and other crops flourished. Muhammad's disciples had already spread his message to Yathrib, and he had many followers there who welcomed him joyfully. As a tribute to Muhammad, the city was renamed Medinat al-Nabi, City of the Prophet, which was shortened to Medina. Muhammad's emigration to Medina, called the Hijra, is one of the most important events in the religion of Islam, as significant to Muslims as Christmas is to Christians. The Islamic calendar begins, with year 1, at the year of the Hijra, which to Christians is the year 622. At the time of his emigration, Muhammad was 52 years old. In Medina, Muhammad became leader of both a religion and a community. He built a mosque and began daily worship services. A mosque is a Muslim church. The word comes from masjid, which means a place of kneeling. Muhammad ruled that people would be called to prayer by a voice rather than bells. Today, in mosques all over the world, 5 times a day, a muezzin calls to the devout to lay aside their work and play and turn towards the sacred city of Mecca in prayer. Muslims didn't always turn towards Mecca in prayer. At the beginning of his stay in Medina, Muhammad had the people praying towards Jerusalem, a Jewish tradition. This was part of his initial attempt to reach out to Jews and Christians. He also set aside the Jewish Sabbath as a day of Muslim prayer. But when the Jews of Medina began to conspire with his enemies in Mecca, Muhammad exiled them from the city and ordered Muslims to face Mecca, not Jerusalem, when praying. Muhammad made other changes in Medina. He abolished the worship of idols. He forbade the killing of unwanted baby girls and put restrictions on divorce and the number of wives a man could have. He changed inheritance laws, developed programs to help the poor, and set up regulations for the trading and owning of slaves. He put a ban on war and violence, with 2 exceptions, for self-defense and for the cause of Islam. He forbade privileges and distinctions based on race or tribal position. While in Medina, Muhammad took 4 wives. Each marriage strengthened his connections with families important to the solidarity of the growing Muslim community. He was given a piece of land on which he built a house around a central courtyard. Each wife was given her own apartment. His followers often joined him in his home for prayer. That home later became the Mosque of Medina. During the years in Medina, Muhammad led his followers on many raids called razzias on caravans of Meccans or Arabs thought to be sympathetic with them. Curiously enough, the largest of these raids were along the route to Syria that the Arab armies followed after his death. The largest raid occurred in 630, when he took 30,000 men on a journey to the Syrian border that took over a month, a raid that pioneered the invasion of Syria. Meanwhile, he was making alliances with tribes all over Arabia, laying the groundwork for the expansion into Syria and Iraq that would occur shortly after his death. At home in Medina, Muhammad took action to limit the opposition to him, expelling clans that were causing problems and maneuvering others out of power. The people of Mecca were not content to have Muhammad only 200 miles away in their rival city Medina. They attacked the city several times over the next 8 years, but were always repelled. The first large battle in this continuing conflict occurred at Badr in 624, when Muhammad was 54. It was a battle he tried to avoid, but farmers whose crops had been ruined by the Meccans persuaded him to fight instead. It was his first military victory, and he took it as divine confirmation of his work. There was another battle the following year at Uhud, which he lost, and that was followed 2 years later by a Meccan siege of Medina, in which 10,000 Meccans failed to cross a large trench Muhammad had ordered his men to dig, and his position was greatly strengthened. After the siege, Muhammad attacked a Jewish clan that had been plotting with the Meccans against him, had all the men executed, and sold the women and children into slavery. Finally, in the year 630, when he was 60 years old, Muhammad decided to end the matter once and for all by marching on Mecca. With 10,000 men behind him, Muhammad came in triumph to the city that had once persecuted him and forced his exile. The people of Mecca, seeing the enormous forces of Muhammad, gave little resistance. He took the town, offering a pardon to all the citizens, including most who had tormented him. His goal was not to seek revenge, but to convert them to Islam. Then he returned to the Kaaba, the sacred stone he had put back in place 25 years earlier. That time there had been a flood of water. This time there would be a flood of spirit. Muhammad strode through the Kaaba, his disciples behind him, and destroyed every pagan idol in the sanctuary. He left only the black stone cube, which he rededicated as a shrine to Allah. He made the Kaaba a mosque, transforming it from a place of ritual to a house of worship. This act was the culmination of his work and mission. He would live only 2 more years. Muhammad returned to Medina and died there in the year 632 at the age of 62, in the presence of his favorite wife, Aisha. Her father, Abu Bakr, became the first caliph, or leader of Islam. Muhammad's tomb is in the city where he died, at the Prophet's Mosque. As frequently happens when a great spiritual teacher dies, the times after Muhammad's death were marked by conflicts and schisms among his followers. Muhammad gave no instructions about who was to lead the Muslims after him, thereby paving the way for a power struggle. In the 600s, the Muslim world split into 2 large divisions, the Sunnites and the Shiites. The Shiites believed that Muslim leadership was restricted to the family of Muhammad, the descendants of Ali. Ali was Muhammad's son-in-law who married his daughter Fatima. Sunnites believed that leadership shifted to the caliphs, elected from Muhammad's tribe. These sects still exist today. The majority of Muslims are Sunnites, and Shiites represent the largest minority group. The followers of Muhammad recorded the visions and teachings of Muhammad by memorizing or writing them down. Much of this was done while he was still alive. He directed his followers to write his revelations on whatever was available: pieces of paper, stones, palm leaves, shoulder blades, ribs, and bits of leather. Later, these records were combined to form the Qur'an, holy book of the Muslims. Qur'an means recitation. Muslims consider the words of the Qur'an to be those of God himself, as spoken to Muhammad by an angel. The Qur'an contains many stories from the Old Testament and the New Testament, including stories about Jesus, whom the Qur'an calls the Word of God. It teaches the absolute oneness and power of God as creator, sustainer, and restorer of the universe. It teaches that God is just and merciful, and that he sends prophets to guide people from their ignorance. It forbids lying, stealing, adultery, and murder, and it teaches kindness, charity to the poor, honesty, and courage. The Qur'an permits slavery under certain conditions, but it encourages people to treat slaves kindly and to free them if they can. It allows a man to have 4 wives, but it gives wives rights that protect them from abuse. Islam teaches that life is a period of testing, and that after death there will be a judgment day when the soul is sent to either heaven or hell, depending on its merits. The event Muslims take most pride in is when their children have memorized the entire Qur'an. All Muslims have memorized the Qur'an in at least part, and many know the entire work by heart. To Muslims, the Qur'an is the ultimate authority in matters of faith, practice, and Islamic law, and the source of their greatest inspiration and wisdom. The Qur'an contains 114 chapters that vary in length from just a few lines to over 200 verses. Most of it is written in rhymed Arabic prose that is so exquisitely beautiful and powerful that Muslims believe the language itself is a miracle that proves the divinity of Muhammad's experience. To imitate the style of the Qur'an is considered sacrilege. For 1,300 years, Muslims refused to translate the Qur'an for fear of destroying the beauty and purity of God's words. But in the early 1900s, they finally began to translate it into both Eastern and Western languages. After Muhammad died, the teachings of Islam spread swiftly. Abu Bakr was elected caliph, or Muslim leader. He and leaders that followed him launched a series of jihads, or holy wars, that built an empire throughout the Near and Middle East. Millions of different people from different cultures were united into one great society. Within only 200 years after Muhammad's death, his followers had spread the faith of Islam all over Arabia, Egypt, Persia, the north coast of Africa, and even to Spain. Later it would reach Turkey in the west and India in the east. From Cordova to Delhi stretched the vast Arab Empire, one of the most sparkling civilizations ever known. It produced brilliant artists, philosophers, poets, and architects, who left us such grand masterpieces as the Taj Mahal in India and the Alhambra in Spain. It was a world of exquisite jewels, elegant silks, intricate tapestries, and luxurious palaces. But this was only the facade, a very beautiful facade, of Islam. The real Islam lay in the teachings of Muhammad and the spirit with which he'd ignited millions of followers. The faith that so rapidly and widely spread throughout the world after its prophet's death is one of the simplest in religious history. It's based primarily on a set of rules laid down by Muhammad, conveyed through his visions, which are called the 5 pillars of Islam. The first is acceptance that there is one and only one God, Allah. I witness there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. The second pillar is prayer 5 times every day, at dawn, noon, afternoon, evening, and nightfall. The prayer is conducted wherever the worshiper is, except on Fridays when it's done in a mosque at noon with fellow Muslims. The third pillar is charity to the poor. Muslims are expected to give 2.5% of their wealth to a trust fund for the needy. The fourth is fasting throughout the month of Ramadan, from sunrise to sunset. The fifth and final pillar is the pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in a lifetime. The journey to Mecca is called a Hajj. Every year during the 12th month of the Muslim year, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims descend on Mecca to fulfill the requirement of the 5th pillar of Islam. Wearing long white robes as prescribed in the Qur'an, they approach the sacred stone of the Kaaba chanting, "Here am I, O God, at thy command. No equal hast thou. Here am I." The Hajj is an exhausting, physically demanding test of the pilgrim's devotion. Worshippers circle the Kaaba 7 times, 3 times jogging and 4 times walking. They kiss the sacred black stone. Then they run another 7 laps between the nearby hills of Safa and Marwa. Most pilgrims also visit the Mosque of Muhammad in Medina. On the 9th day they stand bareheaded from noon till sunset, praying before the Mount of Mercy, where Muhammad delivered his last sermon. The last 3 days of the pilgrimage are spent feasting. Before the pilgrims leave for home, they turn one last time toward the stone and repeat the traditional prayer, "Lord, accept my Hajj." For pilgrims of Islam, the Hajj is the spiritual high point of their lives. Many are so overwhelmed by the experience, they must be supported by others, and many are weeping as they depart. But for all, it is an experience of spiritual replenishment and renewed brotherhood. Islam has no complicated rituals and no priests, although it does have the imam, the chief officer of the mosque, who leads the people in prayer. Prayer is not a matter of beseeching or supplicating, it is simply the praise of God. On Friday, worshippers always wash before entering the mosque to pray, so they may offer that praise in symbolic purity. The service is simple. Worshippers convene at noon. The men face Mecca, and the women stand behind the men, facing Mecca. They recite the first chapter of the Qur'an, a few other passages in praise of Allah, and the Muslim creed. It is the very simplicity of Islam, the purity of it, that has drawn so many followers. Muslims say it's the same religion as Abraham's. It is the religion that always was and always will be, that lives eternally in the hearts of all. Muhammad's life had a deep and lasting effect on history and humanity. He felt himself to be the bringer of a divine message, and this conviction gave him the strength to bring about vast changes in Arabia and in the consciousness of its people. The message Muhammad brought was simple but powerful. There is only one God, and that God requires surrender. Throughout history, the messengers of God have been calling man to return to him. They have called, and they have called, yet man has been unable to see and accept the truth. But God waits. He is ever willing and ever joyous to welcome man's surrender. To Muslims, the path of surrender and submission to God is through Islam, and as soon as it was born, the entire structure of Arabian life was altered and transformed. Loyalty to the tribe was replaced by loyalty to the Muslim community, a community united by its devotion to God. Worship of idols and icons was replaced by worship of the One, Allah. Out of the barren deserts of the Near East, a wasteland unable to sustain people with food, water, or shelter, had come one of the most spiritually nourishing and growth-inducing beliefs of human history, that there is a God, and He is the one and only God. From Abraham's worship of that God had been born three of the world's greatest faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the fruition of the vision of the Prophet Muhammad.